No matter what kind of gamer you were in the early 90s, it was almost impossible to miss Street Fighter 2. It was everywhere, in chip shops, in service stations, in the background of every school conversation about gaming. It was one of those rare cultural moments that transcended the medium entirely and planted itself into mainstream consciousness with the kind of permanence most games can only dream of. But here's the thing, before all of that there was another game. A rougher, stranger, more awkward game that quietly laid the foundation Street Fighter 2 would be built upon. A game that introduced Ryu, a game that introduced the Hadouken and the Shoryuken, a game that introduced the 6-button layout, the international roster concept, and the very idea that a one-on-one fighting game could use command inputs for special moves. And that game has been almost completely ignored ever since the moment its sequel arrived. Which raises a question that's both uncomfortable and fascinating. How does a game that invented one of the most beloved franchises in gaming history end up being the entry that absolutely nobody talks about, defends, or remembers with any real warmth? And unlike Street Fighter 3, which eventually earned its redemption arc, Street Fighter 1 never got one. It remains to this day the forgotten ancestor at a family reunion that everyone politely avoids making eye contact with. So let's get into it. Hello ladies and gentlemen, Big Daddy Top Hat here. If you love fighting game history, subscribe. Let's talk about why nobody cares about Street Fighter 1. Yeah! Street Fighter, it's bloody marvellous, isn't it? But what makes things better than ever is that it has never been easier to experience the entire series on modern hardware. You can get 60% off the first 13 sprite-based editions of Street Fighter, including even Street Fighter 1 itself, as part of the fantastic Street Fighter Anniversary Collection, which includes multiple iterations of Street Fighter 2, Street Fighter 3, and the Alpha games. And honestly, I can also get you huge money off Street Fighter 6, the Marvel vs. Capcom Fighting Collection, and up to 90% off of thousands of other titles too. Every purchase supports the channel directly, so happy shopping, and I hope you enjoy the rest of this video. Street Fighter 1 occupies perhaps the strangest position in the entire history of the franchise, and arguably in the broader history of fighting games as a genre. It is simultaneously foundational and forgotten, the game that made everything possible, yet the one treated as though it barely counts. Released in arcades in August of 1987, designed by Takashi Nishiyama and Hiroshi Matsumoto, Street Fighter was, at the time, genuinely unlike anything else in arcades. It featured large, detailed sprites, digitized voice samples, an international roster of CPU opponents to fight through across 5 countries, and most crucially, a system of command-based special moves that had simply never existed in a one-on-one fighting game before. The Hadouken, produced by a quarter circle motion combined with a punch button, wasn't just a cool move, it was a design language. It told players that if they were willing to learn the input, the game would reward them with something spectacular. The idea would go on to define an entire genre for decades. And yet, despite all of that, Street Fighter 1 is consistently treated as little more than a footnote, an awkward prototype that the franchise had to survive before it could become something worth caring about. And to be fair, that characterization isn't entirely wrong, but it is far too simple. And it papers over a genuinely interesting story about timing, hardware expectations, and what happens when a game is ambitious in ways that the audience isn't yet ready to meet. Part of what makes Street Fighter 1's early history so fascinating is that it didn't fail quietly, it failed physically, and I mean that quite literally. Capcom released the game in 2 distinct arcade cabinet versions. The first, and more conventional, used a standard 6-button layout and joystick, the setup that would go on to become the defining control scheme for the entire fighting game genre. The other, the so-called deluxe version, replaced buttons entirely with 2 large pressure-sensitive rubber pads. The idea was that the strength of your attack, light, medium or heavy, would be determined by how hard you actually hit the pad. In theory, that was a bold and immersive design choice. In practice, it was a disaster. Players would absolutely hammer these pads. Not casually, I mean really hammer them, with the full force of competitive frustration and arcade excitement. The pads were not built to withstand this, and they broke, constantly. arcade operators found themselves maintaining machines that were essentially getting physically assaulted on a daily basis, and Capcom's manufacturers, who were accustomed to producing more conventional hardware, struggled to keep up with the repair demands. The pressure-sensitive cabinets was eventually phased out entirely, but not before it had already poisoned the well for a significant number of early players and arcade operators alike, many of whom associated Street Fighter I with a cabinet that looked exciting but was an ongoing maintenance nightmare. If you know your gaming history, Street Fighter III's struggle was philosophical. Wrong timing, wrong market, too demanding. Street Fighter I's struggles were, in some ways, even more basic. The machine was literally falling apart in front of people. First impressions matter enormously in arcades, where operators choose which cabinets to stock based on reliability and income per square foot. And Street Fighter I's first impression in many locations was a broken rubber pad and an out-of-order sign. Beyond the hardware, there was also structural design choice baked into Street Fighter I that fundamentally limited how players could engage with it. And it's one that the series would decisively abandon almost immediately. You could not choose your character. In single-player mode, you played as Ryu. That was it. No alternatives, no selection screen, no sense of identity or ownership beyond the single stoic martial artist Capcom had assigned you. A second player could join as Ken in competitive matches, but Ken existed purely as a palette swap. Same moveset, same feel, same everything, just with slightly lighter hair. This was not a design decision made with competitive depth in mind. It was the product of an early development approach that prioritized a specific narrative structure. Ryu traveling the world, defeating 10 international opponents over the player agency that would become central to the genre's appeal. Compare this to Street Fighter II, which launched with 8 fully playable characters, each with their own fighting style, nationality, personality, and set of special moves. That selection screen wasn't just a feature, it was an identity moment. Choosing Blanka over Dhalsim, Guile over Chun-Li was a statement. It was something you argued about in the playground. It was yours! Street Fighter I offered none of that. There was no your character, there was only Ryu. This matters because character attachment is, as I've discussed plenty of times in the past, one of the most powerful emotional forces in fighting games. People don't just play fighting games, they become their character, they invest in them, they feel the loss when that character is removed, and they feel the spark when they first discover one that suits them. Street Fighter I lacked that mechanism entirely, and in doing so lacked one of the primary hooks that would have created lasting engagement and community around the game. The world would have to wait a little bit longer for wider character selection. It would be easy to dismiss Street Fighter I as simply a rough first attempt, an undercooked prototype that got lucky with its sequel, but that reading is too generous in one direction and too harsh in another. The truth is more interesting. Street Fighter I was genuinely ambitious, mechanically inventive, and technically impressive for 1987. And it was also profoundly, exhaustingly hard to play in ways that worked against it at almost every level. The special moves, the Hadouken, the Shoryuken, the Tatsumaki, existed and were fully functional. But their input timing was extraordinarily unforgiving by even the standards of later iterations. Players who had no prior reference for what a quarter circle motion meant, or how precisely it needed to be executed on a joystick, would frequently fail to produce the moves at all, cycling through jab 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 while the CPU opponent cheerfully obliterated them. For the more dedicated players who did crack the inputs, there was a further wrinkle. If executed correctly, special moves were so powerful in this game that they could essentially end the round in very few hits. So you had a game where the most interesting mechanics were nearly inaccessible to casual players and borderline overpowered for those who mastered them, with very little middle ground between the two experiences. The AI opponents were also deeply inconsistent, swinging between passive and punishingly aggressive in ways that felt arbitrary rather than designed. There was no real sense of escalating challenge or learning curve. Certain opponents would simply behave in ways that seemed random or unavoidable, which compounded the frustration of already demanding controls. For a game that was asking players to invest real money in arcade credits, that level of inconsistency was commercially self-defeating. None of this makes Street Fighter I a bad game in the absolute sense. It makes the game that was reaching for ideas its own design hadn't yet fully solved, which is, frankly, exactly what a first entry in a groundbreaking series often is. But it does explain why, in the moment, many players bounced off it and kept walking. Street Fighter III was largely ignored on release. It struggled commercially, but it had time. It had a competitive scene that preserved it. It had Evo Moment 37. It had years of gradual reappraisal of tournament footage circulating, of players slowly discovering Third Strike and understanding what it was doing. Street Fighter III got its redemption arc. Imperfect, belated, and commercially irrelevant by the time it arrived, but a redemption arc nonetheless. Street Fighter I got none of that. What Street Fighter I got instead was Street Fighter II, one of the most comprehensively dominant sequels in the history of video games. A sequel so good, so complete, so culturally overwhelming that it didn't just supersede the original, it erased it from the cultural memory of most people who encountered the franchise. Which meant that for many of us idiot children growing up in the 1990s, Street Fighter effectively began at number 2. If you had asked me what Street Fighter 1 was back then, I would probably have confidently explained with the misplaced authority only a 10-year-old can possess that it was basically Street Fighter 2, but with fewer characters. Perhaps just Ryu, Ken, Chun-Li, Guile, Blanka and Dhalsim awkwardly standing around waiting for the rest of the roster to arrive in the sequel. The idea that the first game was actually a strange, clunky, barely recognisable prototype with pressure-sensitive punch buttons and an inexplicable amount of broken mechanics simply never crossed my mind. As far as our playground understanding of gaming history was concerned, Street Fighter II didn't improve on the first game, it simply created the universe outright, like some sort of Big Bang event involving Hadoukens and very loud arcade cabinets. In reality, with Street Fighter II, every weakness of the first game was addressed or corrected. 8 playable characters with distinct movesets replaced the Ryu-only model. Controls were refined, timing windows were more accessible, special moves no longer felt like exploits. The AI behaved in consistent learnable patterns. The presentation was a generational leap forward. There was quite simply no reason for anyone who had played Street Fighter II to go back. And for the vast majority of people who discovered the franchise through Street Fighter II, which was most of the world, Street Fighter I wasn't a game they had left behind. It was a game they had never encountered at all. This is the brutal asymmetry at the heart of Street Fighter I's legacy. It doesn't have haters, it barely has detractors, it has something far worse: indifference. A shrug, the mental category of, oh, that existed I think. As for the original game's legacy, Takashi Nishiyama, the key designer behind Street Fighter I, left Capcom shortly after its release. He went to SNK where he would go on to create Fatal Fury, a series that took clear mechanical inspiration from Street Fighter I and pushed those ideas in a direction Capcom itself had declined to pursue. The blonde character punching through the wall in Street Fighter I's intro is widely cited as an early visual inspiration for Terry Bogard, one of the most beloved characters in SNK's history. Street Fighter I's DNA, in other words, ended up contributing to one of its own most significant rivals. Meanwhile, Yoshiki Okamoto took over the Street Fighter franchise at Capcom and steered development toward what became Street Fighter II, a product so different in philosophy, structure and execution that calling it a sequel almost feels generous. It was more of a reinvention, a clean start that kept the name and a few characters while reimagining everything else from the ground up. The fact that Capcom felt this degree of reconstruction was necessary tells you everything about how they internally regarded Street Fighter I's commercial and design shortcomings. So really, Street Fighter I's creative output didn't really disappear, it scattered. It influenced SNK, it influenced the entire fighting game genre through its input mechanics, it gave the world Ryu, Ken and Sagat. But it did all of this without ever receiving the credit it was due under its own name, because the people who built on its ideas almost immediately outgrew the vessel that carried them. But if you think Street Fighter I's arcade run was complicated, its life on home format was arguably even messier. And it added another layer of reasons why the game never built the kind of sustained audience that might have preserved its reputation. The home ports of Street Fighter I were, to put it charitably, inconsistent. The PC Engine TurboGrafx 16 CD version, known as Fighting Street, was actually a reasonable approximation of the arcade experience for its time, benefiting from the CD format storage capacity and offering a more faithful translation than most platforms could manage. The versions on MS-DOS and the various British home computers of the era, such as the Commodore 64 and the ZX Spectrum, ranged from serviceable to genuinely poor, stripped of visual fidelity, responsive controls, and much of the arcade's atmosphere in ways that made an already demanding game feel worse. This stands in contrast to Street Fighter II's home port story, where the Super Nintendo version, though imperfect, captured enough of the game's energy and character to sell millions of units and cement the franchise's place in an entire generation's living rooms. Street Fighter II on the Super NES was transformative. Street Fighter I on the Amiga & Co, for most players, was a game that made them glad they hadn't paid full price. The fact of the matter is that there was no single home release of Street Fighter I that did for the original what the Super Nintendo version did for Street Fighter II. And because most players outside of Japan encountered fighting games primarily through home versions rather than arcades, especially in the UK and Europe, Street Fighter I simply never had the moment that might have lodged it in popular memory in quite the same way. Street Fighter I in 2026 is a genuinely difficult game to enjoy on its own terms. The controls require patience, the single player experience is limited, and the absence of a character select screen eliminates one of the most compelling reasons to return to retro fighting games. You can admire it, you can respect what it was trying to do, but loving it in the way that people love Third Strike or Super Turbo requires a specific kind of historical generosity that most players simply aren't motivated to extend. But partly, it's something more fundamental. Street Fighter I was never given a narrative. Street Fighter III's story has a shape. Misunderstood masterpiece, beloved underground, eventual vindication. That's a compelling arc. People love an underdog story. Street Fighter I's story has no such shape. It was imperfect, it was superseded, and it was left behind. There is no twist. There is no vindication. There is just the quiet reality of a genuinely important game that nobody needs to think about because everything it created was immediately made better by the thing that replaced it. It would be tempting then to argue that Street Fighter I deserves a second look, that it's unfairly dismissed, that if you squint at it in the right historical light, it's secretly brilliant and we've all been wrong to ignore it. But I'm not going to do that, because I don't think that's quite true, and I suspect you'd see through it immediately. Street Fighter I is not a misunderstood masterpiece. It is a prototype, an extraordinary, genuinely innovative prototype that introduced ideas the entire industry would be built on, in a package that was never quite polished or accessible enough to sustain the love it would have needed to survive the arrival of its own sequel. It got its sequel too right. Street Fighter II was so good that it not only replaced Street Fighter I, it retroactively made Street Fighter I feel like it never existed. And that is, in its own strange way, a remarkable thing to have achieved. So, the cold hard truth is that everyone tends to ignore Street Fighter I because Street Fighter II made that the only rational choice. And if that sounds harsh, consider this. No game in history has ever had its ideas stolen so thoroughly, so lovingly, and so successfully by its own direct sequel, so completely that it ceased to exist. But that is almost the case with Street Fighter I. And that, honestly, is a kind of immortality, even if it's one that comes without a name. Don't forget, it has never been easier to experience the entire Street Fighter series on modern hardware. You can get 60% off the first 13 sprite-based editions of Street Fighter, including even Street Fighter I itself as part of the fantastic Street Fighter 30th Anniversary Collection, which includes multiple iterations of Street Fighter 2, Street Fighter 3 and the Alpha games. And honestly, I can also get you huge money off Street Fighter 6, the Marvel vs. Capcom Fighting Collection, and up to 90% off of thousands of other titles too. Every purchase directly supports this channel, so happy shopping, and I'll see you all again very soon. Don't forget to subscribe, and cheerio.